Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Atlas Archives. Tonight we're venturing to Guinea-Bissau, a small West African nation that proves size has absolutely nothing to do with the complexity of a country's story. Nestled between Senegal and Guinea on the Atlantic coast, Guinea-Bissau is roughly the size of Taiwan, yet its history unfolds like an intricate tapestry woven from ancient kingdoms, Portuguese colonial intrigue, revolutionary liberation struggles, and modern challenges that would make a soap opera writer weep with envy. Tonight, we'll journey through time and space to discover how this seemingly quiet corner of Africa became home to matriarchal island societies, brilliant military strategists who outmaneuvered European colonial powers, and a people whose resilience could power a small generator if properly harnessed. If you find yourself getting lost in this story, and trust me, it's easy to do, hit that subscribe button so you won't miss our future adventures. The world is full of incredible places, with even more incredible stories, and your support helps us keep telling them. So grab your favourite blanket, settle into that perfect spot, and let's begin our gentle exploration of Guinea-Bissau, where every island has a tale, and every tale has a twist. Chapter 1: The Land Between Waters. Picture, if you will, a place where the ocean doesn't simply meet the shore, but rather braids itself into the very fabric of the land, creating a tapestry so intricate that it's sometimes difficult to tell where water ends and earth begins. Guinea-Bissau occupies 36,125 square kilometers of West African coastline, making it roughly the size of Switzerland, though infinitely more watery and decidedly less mountainous. It's the kind of place where cartographers probably developed chronic headaches trying to draw accurate maps, because frankly, the coastline seems to have been designed by someone with a particularly artistic interpretation of what a border should look like. Nestled between Senegal to the north and Guinea to the east and south, Guinea-Bissau faces the vast Atlantic Ocean to the west, its shoreline stretching for 350 kilometers of deeply indented coast that looks as though the ocean spent centuries playfully nibbling at the edges of the continent. The country added Bissau to its name after independence in 1974, borrowing from its capital city to avoid confusion with its neighbour Guinea, which had the audacity to claim the name first when it gained independence from France in 1958. It's rather like living in a neighbourhood where everyone insists on naming their house the cottage, and then acting surprised when the mail gets mixed up. What makes Guinea-Bissau truly exceptional isn't just its modest size or its serpentine coastline, but rather its crown jewel, the Bijagós Archipelago, a collection of 88 islands scattered across the Atlantic like emeralds dropped from a giant's jewellery box. These islands, stretching across 100 kilometres of ocean, form the only active deltaic archipelago on Africa's Atlantic coast, and one of the few such formations in the entire world. 23 of these islands are inhabited year-round, though the term inhabited should be understood loosely, as some have populations smaller than a typical university lecture hall. The archipelago was formed from the ancient deltas of the Guiba and Grande de Buba rivers, now mostly submerged beneath rising sea levels that transformed what were once river mouths into a maritime wonderland. Orango, the largest island at 272 square kilometres, hosts the country's only national park, and serves as a reminder that sometimes the most beautiful places on Earth are also the most difficult to reach. The isolation of these islands has preserved both extraordinary biodiversity and traditional culture, with some islands remaining sacred spaces where modern development is restricted not by government regulation, but by indigenous customs that predate any written law. In 2025, UNESCO recognized the exceptional nature of this marine ecosystem by designating the coastal and marine ecosystems of the Bijagós Archipelago as a World Heritage Site. The archipelago supports over 870,000 migratory shorebirds, because apparently word has gotten out in the avian community that the Bijagós offer some of the finest beachfront real estate in West Africa. The islands also serve as nesting grounds for endangered green and leatherback turtles, who have presumably not yet received the memo about rising sea levels and continue to treat Poilau Island as one of the world's premier turtle maternity wards. The mainland of Guinea-Bissau presents a geography that can only be described as emphatically horizontal. Almost the entire country is low-lying, with the highest point reaching a modest 277 metres at a place called Dongle Ronde, which sounds like it should be a character in a fantasy novel but is actually just a hill that happens to be taller than everything else around it. This low-lying topography has profound consequences. Tidal waters reach as far as 100 kilometres inland, meaning that twice daily the Atlantic Ocean essentially borrows large portions of the country for a few hours before politely returning them. The southeastern region features the Fouta Djallon Plateau, which rises approximately 180 metres above sea level and represents the country's modest attempt at mountainous terrain. The plateau extends from neighbouring Guinea and forms what geographers diplomatically describe as slightly elevated terrain, which is rather like describing a giraffe as somewhat tall. The Bowie Hills extend westward from the Fouta Djallon toward the Korubal Basin, creating a landscape that undulates gently across the country like a vast green blanket that someone has carelessly rumpled. Perhaps no feature defines Guinea-Bissau's geography more dramatically than its mangrove forests, which cover approximately 8% of the national territory and form one of West Africa's most extensive mangrove systems. These tidal forests line rivers and coasts, creating otherworldly landscapes that change dramatically with each tidal cycle. The mangrove's twisted roots rise above high tide levels like the fingers of ancient spirits reaching toward the sky, creating nurseries for fish, habitat for the endangered West African manatee, and natural barriers against coastal erosion. During high tide, approximately 10% of Guinea-Bissau's coastal land disappears beneath the waves, a phenomenon that would be deeply concerning in most countries, but here is simply Tuesday. This regular submersion causes extensive salt deposits to accumulate in the soil of the coastal plain, leading to the construction of numerous anti-salt dams along the Atlantic coast. It's an ongoing battle between human engineering and natural forces, with the ocean playing the role of a persistent neighbour who keeps borrowing things and forgetting to return them. The country's river system reads like a geography textbook written by someone with a poetic sensibility. 6 major rivers drain Guinea-Bissau, each with its own character and challenges. The Cachot flows near the northern border with Senegal and is also known as Farim for part of its course, because apparently one name wasn't enough for a river that spans multiple regions. The Mansoa flows from the centre of the country and empties into the Atlantic near Bissau, while the Geba originates in Senegal and bisects the country like a watery highway, connecting interior plains to coastal estuaries. The Korubal River meanders close to the southern border with Guinea, followed by the Cassine along the actual border, and finally the Rio Grande, which, despite its Spanish-sounding name, flows through this Portuguese-speaking nation with apparent linguistic confidence. These rivers provide the principal means of transportation in a country where roads are suggestions rather than guarantees, and where the distinction between navigable waterway and flooded field often depends entirely on the season and one's definition of navigable. The coastal area presents a dense network of drowned valleys called rias, which sounds like a geological term invented by someone who spent too much time staring at aerial photographs of deeply indented coastlines. These rias create a shoreline so complex that it resembles a fractal pattern, with inlets leading to smaller inlets, which lead to even smaller inlets, until you begin to suspect that the ocean is simply showing off its ability to create infinite variations on the theme of water meets land. Guinea-Bissau's climate follows the familiar West African pattern of wet and dry seasons, though with its own distinctive maritime twist. The tropical climate means temperatures remain remarkably stable year-round, averaging around 26.3 degrees Celsius, because apparently the weather in Guinea-Bissau subscribes to the philosophy that consistency is key. The rainy season runs from June to November, bringing southwesterly monsoon winds and enough precipitation to transform the landscape into a maze of waterways and flooded plains. During the dry season from December to May, harmattan winds blow from the northeast, carrying dust from the Sahara and creating the kind of dry, hazy conditions that make distant objects shimmer like mirages. The capital city of Bissau receives an average of 2,024 millimeters of rainfall annually, though this precipitation is almost entirely concentrated during the rainy months, creating a climate where you're either very wet or very dry, with little middle ground for meteorological moderation. The archipelago and coastal wetlands support an extraordinary diversity of ecosystems, from mangroves with intertidal zones to palm forests, dry and semi-dry forests, secondary and degraded forests, coastal savanna, sandbanks, and aquatic zones that change character with every tide. This diversity creates habitat for species that exist nowhere else on Earth, including populations of hippopotamuses who have apparently decided that island life suits them, despite being mammals more commonly associated with river systems than oceanic archipelagos. West African manatees drift through the tidal channels like gentle underwater ambassadors, sharing their watery realm with bottlenose dolphins, who presumably appreciate the abundance of fish nurseries created by the mangrove systems. Nile crocodiles patrol the rivers and estuaries, serving as apex predators in a system where the boundary between fresh and salt water shifts twice daily with the tides. This geographic complexity has shaped not only the natural environment, but also human settlement patterns throughout Guinea-Bissau's history. Most large urban centres cluster along the coastline, taking advantage of access to both maritime resources and river transportation networks. The interior remains sparsely populated, partly due to seasonal flooding that transforms vast areas into temporary lakes, and partly because coastal communities have historically found the sea more reliable than the land for both sustenance and commerce. The population of approximately 2 million people is distributed across 8 administrative regions, plus the autonomous sector of Bissau, with population density averaging around 56 people per square kilometre. However, this figure is misleading, as population distribution is far from uniform. Rural areas may have fewer inhabitants per square kilometre than some office buildings, while Bissau houses nearly 400,000 people in a relatively compact urban area that serves as the country's political, economic, and cultural centre. Ethnically, Guinea-Bissau represents one of West Africa's most diverse societies, with over 20 distinct ethnic groups calling the country home. The Balante people comprise about 30% of the population and are concentrated in the southern coastal regions, while the Fula and Mandinka-speaking peoples make up approximately 43% combined and live primarily in the north and northeast. The Papel people, at 7%, inhabit the central coastal areas, while the Manjako, at 14%, occupy both central and northern coastal regions. This ethnic diversity is reflected in the linguistic landscape, where Portuguese serves as the official language, despite being spoken as a first language by only 2% of the population, and as a second language by 33%. Guinea-Bissau Creole, or Creole, serves as the national lingua franca, spoken as a first language by 54% of the population and as a second language by 40%. The remainder communicate in various indigenous African languages that reflect the country's position at the intersection of multiple cultural and linguistic traditions. The religious landscape mirrors this diversity, with approximately 50% of the population practicing Islam, 20% Christianity, predominantly Roman Catholicism, and 30% maintaining traditional African spiritual beliefs. However, these categories overlap significantly, as Christianity and Islam in Guinea-Bissau are often enriched with African traditional elements, creating a unique religious syncretism where saints' days might be celebrated with traditional drumming and masked dances, and where Islamic practices incorporate ancestral veneration and animistic elements. As we prepare to delve deeper into Guinea-Bissau's fascinating history, it's worth pausing to appreciate the profound influence that geography has exerted on every aspect of life in this remarkable nation. The interplay between land and sea, the rhythm of tides and seasons, the abundance of islands and rivers, all have shaped not just where people live and how they make their living, but how they understand their place in the world and their relationship with the natural environment that surrounds them. Tomorrow, as you wake and perhaps wonder about the strange dreams that visited you in the night, remember this place where the ocean borrows the land twice daily, where islands drift in the Atlantic like scattered jewels, and where the distinction between water and earth is far more flexible than most geography textbooks would lead you to believe. Guinea-Bissau exists as a reminder that the world still contains places where human communities have learned to live, not in opposition to their environment, but in harmony with its rhythms and cycles, creating a way of life that is both ancient and remarkably adapted to one of the planet's most dynamic and challenging landscapes. And with that gentle thought, let your mind drift like the tides toward the peaceful shores of sleep, while our journey together continues in the morning light, when we shall explore the ancient roots and early peoples who first learned to call this watery paradise home. Chapter 2: Ancient Roots and Early Peoples. Long before European ships appeared on the distant horizon of the Atlantic, the lands that would become Guinea-Bissau pulsed with the rhythms of human civilization. Archaeological evidence suggests that this corner of West Africa has been continuously inhabited for over a millennium, hosting a succession of communities who learned to thrive in the challenging yet rewarding environment where rivers meet the sea. The earliest inhabitants were hunter-gatherers who arrived around 1000 CE, drawn perhaps by the abundance of marine resources and the relative security offered by the mangrove-fringed coastline. These first residents evolved into decentralized animist agricultural communities who discovered that the tidal rivers and coastal wetlands offered ideal conditions for rice cultivation. They developed sophisticated iron implements specifically designed for working the waterlogged soils, becoming some of the earliest practitioners of mangrove swamp rice farming in West Africa. This agricultural innovation would prove crucial as it allowed communities to flourish in areas that might have seemed unsuitable for farming to peoples from drier regions. The relationship between these early farmers and their aquatic environment was intimate and complex, requiring detailed knowledge of tidal patterns, soil salinity, and seasonal flooding that would be passed down through generations. By the 10th to 14th centuries CE, a remarkable migration was taking place across West Africa. The Balanta people, whose name translates to "those who resist" in Mandinka, began arriving in small groups from what their oral traditions describe as the eastern regions, possibly modern-day Sudan. Recent genetic studies have revealed fascinating evidence supporting these migration stories, with some Balanta samples containing haplogroups M1 and U6, which are typically associated with North Africa, East Africa, and the Middle East. Even more intriguingly, certain Balanta genetic markers match exclusively with Sudanese and Moroccan sequences, suggesting a complex migration pattern that may have involved a Cushitic group travelling westward approximately 2,000 years ago. The Balanta brought with them agricultural expertise centered around upland crops like millet, sorghum, and yams, but they proved remarkably adaptable to their new coastal environment. Once they reached the mangrove frontier, they transformed into what scholars describe as deep rural people, embracing an isolationist approach that allowed them to maintain their cultural identity while developing new agricultural techniques suited to their watery new home. They became masters of mangrove swamp rice cultivation, a skill that would define their cultural identity for centuries to come, even as their initiation ceremonies continued to feature millet and sorghum divination rituals that recalled their upland origins. The Balanta social organization was fascinatingly egalitarian, built around councils of elders who made collective decisions through consensus rather than hierarchical command. To join these councils, men had to undergo the fanado ceremony, an intense initiation ritual that took place in sacred woods over a period of 2 months. The fanado was not merely a rite of passage, but a transformative ordeal that tested the physical, mental, and spiritual fortitude of young men. Those who survived emerged as Lante and Dang, brave and wise, distinguished by bright red hats that marked their new status as full members of adult society capable of participating in village governance. The secrecy surrounding the fanado was absolute. Everything connected to the ritual was burned after completion, and the details were guarded so jealously that mothers learned the fate of their sons only when the survivors returned to the village. This emphasis on secrecy and collective initiation created strong bonds among age groups and reinforced the egalitarian values that made the Balanta notoriously difficult for outsiders to govern. Portuguese colonialists would later discover that the Balanta's decentralized decision-making and collective resistance to authority made them nearly impossible to control through traditional colonial methods. In the 13th century, the political landscape of the region underwent a dramatic transformation with the expansion of the Mali Empire under Sundiata Keita. Mali's General Tiramakan Traoré led military campaigns westward, conquering Senegambia in what oral traditions describe as a punitive expedition against the Wolof king for insulting Sundiata. This conquest extended Mali's influence south of the Gambia River into the Casamance region, initiating a significant migration of Mandinka people into what is now Guinea-Bissau. By the 14th century, much of the region was administered by Mali through a provincial system that established Kabu as a powerful secondary kingdom. The empire maintained control through local rulers called pharims, whose responsibility was to ensure law and order while guaranteeing the flow of tributary goods and soldiers to the imperial centre. Gold, slaves, and marine salt flowed eastward from the Guinea coast toward Mali's interior, while manufactured goods, ideas, and administrative practices moved in the opposite direction, creating a dynamic economic and cultural exchange network. The Kingdom of Kabu emerged as something truly remarkable in West African political history. Initially established as a Mali province, it gradually evolved into an independent federation of kingdoms that would become the era's most powerful Western Mandinka state. Kabu's ruling class consisted of elite warriors known as the Nyancho, who traced their patrilineal lineage directly to Tiramakan Traoré, and thus claimed legitimacy through their connection to Mali's founding military campaigns. This warrior aristocracy created a sophisticated political system that balanced centralized authority with local autonomy, allowing diverse ethnic groups to maintain their cultural practices while participating in a larger political framework. The Nyancho developed a complex feudal system that differed significantly from European models. Local communities retained considerable autonomy in daily affairs while contributing to collective defense and regional trade networks. The kingdom's capital at Kansala became a major political and commercial center, hosting elaborate ceremonies that reinforced the political hierarchy while celebrating the cultural diversity of Kabu's constituent peoples. The kingdom's tolerance for ethnic and religious diversity was remarkable for its time, allowing Islamic, Christian, and traditional animist practices to coexist within its borders. Parallel to these mainland political developments, the Bijagós Archipelago was evolving its own unique civilization. The islands attracted settlers from various ethnic backgrounds, but isolation and environmental challenges shaped these diverse groups into something extraordinary. The Bijagós people, who developed one of West Africa's most distinctive cultural systems. Archaeological evidence suggests that the islands were first settled around 9000 BCE, making them among the oldest continuously inhabited areas in the region, though the specific ethnic identity of the Bijagós likely emerged later through the blending of multiple migration waves. The Bijagós creation myth provides fascinating insight into how they understood their social organization. According to legend, the creator god Nindo first made Orango Island as the world, then created a man and woman named Akapakama. She bore 4 daughters, Orakuma, Amílcar, Ogubane, and Oraga, who became the founders of the 4 clans that would organize Bijagós society. Each clan received specific responsibilities and privileges. Orakuma managed land and religious ceremonies, including the right to carve the sacred Iran statues that housed ancestral spirits. Amílcar controlled the sea and fishing rights. Oraga received dominion over nature, fields, and palm trees, while Ogubane was granted power over rain and wind, controlling the seasonal cycles that governed island life. This mythological framework supported what many observers have described as a matriarchal or matrilineal society, though recent scholarly analysis suggests the reality was more complex. While women undoubtedly held significant power in Bijagós culture, choosing their husbands, owning houses, managing family resources, and serving as spiritual intermediaries. Some researchers argue that closer examination reveals underlying patriarchal structures that coexisted with female authority in specific domains. The truth likely lies somewhere between these interpretations, with gender roles being more fluid and context-dependent than either purely matriarchal or patriarchal models would suggest. What is certain is that Bijagós women exercised remarkable authority by the standards of most neighbouring societies. They initiated courtship, managed household economies, participated actively in legal proceedings, and served as priestesses in religious ceremonies. Houses passed from mother to daughter, meaning that men moved into their wives' homes upon marriage, and children belonged to their mother's clan. In cases of divorce, fathers had no automatic rights over their children, a practice that reversed typical West African patterns. This female authority was reinforced through spiritual beliefs that positioned women as conduits for communication with the ancestral realm. The Bijagós developed sophisticated naval capabilities that made them formidable players in regional politics and trade. Their large ocean-going canoes, called almadías, could carry up to 70 people and were capable of long-distance voyages that connected the islands with mainland communities and other coastal societies. These vessels were more than transportation. They were symbols of Bijagós technological innovation and maritime mastery that allowed a relatively small island population to project power far beyond their archipelago. In pre-European times, the Bijagós Islands served as a crucial hub in West African coastal trade networks. The islanders' naval expertise and strategic location made them indispensable intermediaries who controlled access to interior trade routes. They developed diplomatic relationships with mainland kingdoms while maintaining their independence through military strength and geographic isolation. This position allowed them to accumulate wealth and political influence that far exceeded what their small population might otherwise have commanded. The artistic traditions of the Bijagós reflected their unique cultural synthesis and spiritual beliefs. They created distinctive portable ancestor shrines called Iran, which served as focal points for communication with deceased family members and clan spirits. Their zoomorphic masks, representing animals like sharks, stingrays, and bulls, were used in elaborate ceremonies that marked important transitions in individual and community life. The famous Vaca Bruto ceremonies featured masks representing wild bulls and served as tests of courage and spiritual power for young men seeking to prove their readiness for adult responsibilities. These art forms served as repositories of cultural knowledge and spiritual power, with specialized skills passed down through specific lineages. The finished pieces were believed to contain the spiritual essence of the animals or ancestors they represented, while variations from island to island reflected local histories and traditions. Religious practices among the early peoples were predominantly animist, centering on beliefs that natural objects, places, and creatures possessed spiritual essence. Sacred groves, rivers, and islands served as sites for communion with ancestral spirits and nature deities. These spiritual traditions created strong environmental consciousness, as disturbing sacred sites was believed to invite supernatural retribution that could affect entire communities. Coastal peoples developed particularly sophisticated integration of spiritual and ecological knowledge, encoding their understanding of seasonal patterns, animal behaviors, and plant cycles in religious calendars and ritual practices. Trade networks facilitated the exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies across the region. Salt from coastal evaporation pans was traded inland for iron tools and agricultural products, while exotic goods from distant regions passed through local markets. These networks also spread innovations like ironworking techniques and maritime technologies, while languages borrowed words and concepts from each other, creating the linguistic diversity that would later ease the adoption of trade languages. The agricultural innovations developed by these early peoples created lasting impact. Mastery of mangrove swamp rice cultivation allowed communities to thrive in challenging environments, creating food surpluses that supported population growth and craft specialization, while establishing Guinea-Bissau as an important rice-producing region in West African trade networks. By the 15th century, when European explorers began arriving, they encountered sophisticated civilizations with complex political systems, advanced agricultural techniques, and extensive trade networks. The Kingdom of Kabu controlled the mainland through its feudal system. The Bijagós maintained their maritime empire, and coastal peoples had developed specialized expertise in everything from ironworking to salt production. These societies were dynamic and adaptable, constantly evolving in response to changing circumstances while maintaining core cultural values. They had experienced centuries of migration, conquest, and cultural exchange that prepared them for the challenges European contact would bring. Their sophisticated environmental understanding, complex social institutions, and proven adaptability would serve them well in the turbulent centuries ahead. The legacy of these ancient peoples continues to shape modern Guinea-Bissau. The Balanta remain the largest ethnic group and maintain many traditional practices, including rice cultivation techniques still used today. The Bijagós continue to inhabit their ancestral islands, preserving cultural traditions that have survived centuries of external pressure. Political traditions established by Kabu influence contemporary approaches to governance, while early agricultural innovations continue to support rural livelihoods. Understanding these ancient roots helps explain many aspects of contemporary Guinea-Bissau. The country's ethnic diversity reflects centuries of migration and cultural blending. The strength of traditional authorities alongside modern political institutions echoes flexible pre-colonial political systems. The sophisticated environmental knowledge of rural communities draws on centuries of accumulated wisdom about living sustainably in challenging ecosystems. Most importantly, the resilience and adaptability that characterize Guinea-Bissau's peoples today are traits forged through centuries of managing change while preserving cultural identity. As we prepare to explore how Portuguese contact transformed these societies, it's important to remember that European arrival marked not the beginning of Guinea-Bissau's history, but a new chapter in a long story. The societies Europeans encountered were not passive recipients of foreign influence, but active agents with their own strategies for managing change. Their responses to colonial pressure would be shaped by centuries of experience in adaptation, while maintaining cultural continuity. Chapter 3: The Portuguese Colonial Period. In 1455, the Atlantic horizon that had stretched unbroken for millennia suddenly sprouted white sails belonging to vessels that would forever alter the trajectory of Guinea-Bissau's history. The first European to reach the region was Alvise Cadamosto, a Venetian explorer working for Portuguese Prince Henry the Navigator, who arrived with his characteristic Italian flair for both adventure and commerce. He was followed in 1456 by Portuguese explorer Diogo Gomes, who demonstrated the Portuguese talent for claiming everything they could see and several things they couldn't, and later by Flemish explorer Eustache de la Fosse, proving that news of promising new lands travelled faster in the 15th century than modern internet rumours. These early encounters were markedly different from the dramatic conquest narratives that characterized European expansion elsewhere. The Portuguese, despite their impressive maritime technology and undeniable courage, found themselves facing sophisticated African societies that were neither impressed by European pretensions nor inclined to surrender their autonomy to foreign visitors. The Kingdom of Kabu controlled much of the interior through its complex feudal system. The Bijagós commanded the seas from their island strongholds, and coastal peoples like the Balante had perfected the art of organized resistance that would frustrate Portuguese ambitions for centuries. The early Portuguese presence consisted primarily of trading posts established along navigable rivers, with the most important settlements developing at Cachao, Bissau, and Guinea. These weren't colonies in the modern sense, but rather precarious commercial outposts that existed at the sufferance of local rulers who controlled access to food, water, and trade routes. The Portuguese quickly learned that success in Guinea required diplomacy rather than domination, negotiation rather than conquest, and the wisdom to understand that they were junior partners in a complex regional economy that had functioned perfectly well without European participation. Perhaps no group embodied the peculiar nature of early Portuguese colonialism better than the Lançados, whose name literally translates to those who were thrown out. These were Portuguese settlers, traders, exiles, and adventurers who had been cast adrift by circumstances and found themselves washing up on African shores like human flotsam. Many were new Christians or crypto-Jews fleeing the Portuguese Inquisition. Others were criminals seeking refuge beyond the reach of Portuguese law, and some were simply ambitious merchants willing to risk everything for the promise of African gold and spices. The Lançados ignored official Portuguese trade regulations with the same enthusiasm that teenagers ignore parental advice, establishing clandestine networks for trading weapons, spices, and slaves that operated entirely outside royal oversight. This black market infuriated the Portuguese crown, which discovered that collecting taxes from people who had deliberately placed themselves beyond governmental reach was rather like trying to tax the wind. The Lançados married African women from local ruling families, thereby securing protection and trading relationships that worked to everyone's advantage except the Portuguese treasuries. These mixed marriages created a new social category, the Tangamaus, people of mixed African and European descent who served as crucial intermediaries between the two worlds. The Tangamaus were often bilingual and bicultural, growing up with feet firmly planted in both African and European societies, which made them invaluable as translators, diplomats, and commercial agents. They functioned as living bridges between civilizations, though they also represented Portuguese colonial control's fundamental weakness, the need to rely on people whose primary loyalty was to local rather than imperial interests. The slave trade that developed in Guinea-Bissau was both extensive and complex, involving not just Portuguese merchants but African rulers, Arab traders, and eventually English, French, and Dutch competitors who recognized the region's strategic importance. Unlike the brutal plantation systems that developed elsewhere, the slave trade in Guinea operated through existing African political structures, with local rulers determining who could be enslaved and under what circumstances. The Bijagós Islands, with their powerful navy and strategic location, became major suppliers of captives taken in raids against mainland communities. Slaves were captured through various mechanisms that revealed the complex social dynamics of the region. Some were taken as punishment for law-breaking. Others sold themselves or relatives during famines. Many were kidnapped by raiders, both African and European, and significant numbers were prisoners of war from the constant conflicts between different kingdoms and ethnic groups. The grumaids, African mercenaries who worked for European traders, drove bound groups of captives called coffles to coastal barracoons at Cachet, Bissau, and Bolama, where Tangamaus negotiated prices and handled the logistics of human commerce. The market at Cachet developed into one of West Africa's major slave ports, handling thousands of captives annually who were destined primarily for Cape Verde's plantation economy and eventually for Brazil and the Caribbean. Cape Verde became a crucial intermediary in this trade, serving as both a collection point for slaves and a source of the panos textiles that became standard currency throughout the region. These cloth strips, woven from slave-produced cotton and dyed with slave-gathered indigo, created a regional economy that was literally woven from human suffering. From 1580 to 1640, during the period of Iberian Union when Spain controlled Portugal, thousands of Guinea-Bissauan slaves were shipped annually to Spanish colonies in the Americas. The scale was staggering. Guyana alone exported approximately 3,000 people per year during this period, representing not just individual tragedies, but the systematic disruption of entire communities and the transfer of human resources that might have supported African development to European colonial projects thousands of miles away. The social impact of the slave trade extended far beyond the immediate victims. Wars between different ethnic groups increasingly resembled organized hunting expeditions designed to capture people for sale, rather than conflicts over territory or political power. Every ethnic group in the region participated except the Balanta and Jola, who maintained their fierce independence partly through their decentralized political systems that made them difficult to raid successfully, and partly through their well-deserved reputation for organized resistance that made attacking them more trouble than the potential profits justified. Portuguese control remained tenuous throughout the early colonial period, consisting more of influence than authority and more of negotiation than domination. When Portuguese Captain Major was captured and killed by the local king in the early 1700s, the Portuguese simply abandoned Bissau and retreated to Cachet, not returning until the 1750s. This pattern of advance and retreat, presence and absence, characterized Portuguese colonialism in Guinea-Bissau for centuries, and demonstrated that European technological advantages meant little without local political support. The Kingdom of Bissau, founded according to oral tradition by the son of the King of Quinara who moved to the area with his pregnant sister and 6 wives, proved particularly resistant to Portuguese pressure. The kingdom successfully defended its sovereignty against repeated Portuguese pacification campaigns, defeating Portuguese forces in 1891, 1894, and 1904 with a consistency that must have been deeply embarrassing to European military pride. These victories demonstrated that African societies were perfectly capable of adopting and adapting European military technologies while maintaining their political independence. The late 18th and early 19th centuries brought new challenges, as European powers began competing more aggressively for African territories. The British briefly attempted to establish a foothold on Bolama Island in the 1790s, though they abandoned the effort in 1793 when they discovered that holding territory required more commitment than claiming it. The French pressured Portuguese boundaries from the north and eventually succeeded in gaining control over the valuable Casamance region in 1886, demonstrating that even European colonialism was subject to competition and that Portuguese claims meant little without the power to enforce them. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 fundamentally changed the rules of African colonization by introducing the principle of effective occupation. This meant that European powers could no longer simply claim vast territories based on coastal trading posts or theoretical maps, but had to demonstrate actual administrative control over the areas they wanted to possess. For Portugal, this represented both a challenge and an opportunity. A challenge because their control over Guinea-Bissau was largely theoretical, and an opportunity because effective occupation might finally resolve the ambiguous political situation that had persisted for centuries. The Portuguese response to this challenge was Captain João Teixeira Pinto's brutal pacification campaigns conducted from 1913 to 1915. These military operations represented a fundamental shift in Portuguese colonial strategy. From accommodation and negotiation to conquest and subjugation, Teixeira Pinto allied himself with Fula troops under the command of Abdul Injai, a Senegalese fugitive who had assembled a large mercenary army and was willing to work with anyone who could pay for his services. The pacification campaigns were characterized by systematic violence designed to break African resistance through terror rather than conventional warfare. Villages were destroyed, cattle seized, populations displaced, and traditional leaders killed or forced into submission. The campaigns established Portuguese control, but at enormous human cost that brought international criticism and demonstrated the violence inherent in European colonialism, when local accommodation no longer sufficed for imperial ambitions. Even after achieving military victory on the mainland, the Portuguese discovered that the Bijagós Islands presented unique challenges that required additional campaigns in 1917, 1925, and 1936 before they could claim complete control over the archipelago. The islanders' maritime capabilities, intimate knowledge of their complex geography, and fierce determination to maintain independence made them formidable opponents who extracted a high price for every Portuguese victory. The final conquest of the Bijagós in 1936 marked the end of indigenous resistance, but also represented the closing of a historical chapter that had seen African societies successfully resist European expansion for nearly 5 centuries. Portuguese colonial administration that emerged after the pacification campaigns was characteristically bureaucratic, extractive, and paternalistic. Guinea-Bissau was administered jointly with Cape Verde until 1879, then separately as Portuguese Guinea, then redesignated as an overseas province in 1951 in a cosmetic change designed to make colonialism seem more respectable in an era of growing international criticism. These administrative shuffles changed little for ordinary Guineans, who continued to experience colonial rule as taxation without representation, forced labour without compensation, and cultural suppression without explanation. The colonial economy was extractive and underdeveloped, designed to provide raw materials for export rather than support local development. The Portuguese built limited infrastructure, roads, bridges, hospitals, and schools, primarily to facilitate resource extraction. Groundnut production became the primary export, rising from 5,000 tons in 1910 to 20,000 tons in 1925, though profits flowed primarily to Portuguese merchants rather than African farmers. Portuguese rule imposed forced labour systems that were slavery in all but name, requiring Africans to work on infrastructure projects for minimal wages, often paid in goods. The hut tax forced communities into the cash economy by requiring Portuguese currency that could only be obtained through Portuguese employers. This created a colonial economy based on coercion rather than consent, extraction rather than development. Cultural suppression was another hallmark of Portuguese policy, though implemented inconsistently. Traditional religious practices were discouraged but continued in modified forms blending African and Christian elements. Indigenous languages were marginalized in favor of Portuguese, though Creole emerged as a lingua franca, demonstrating Africans' ability to create new cultural forms. The Portuguese disrupted traditional political structures, but never fully replaced them with colonial alternatives that commanded genuine African allegiance. Education under Portuguese rule was limited and designed to create a small class of assimilated Africans who could serve colonial administrative needs. By 1970, only 0.3% of Guineans qualified as assimilated, able to speak Portuguese, literate, and employed. Criteria that excluded virtually the entire African population from full participation in the colonial system. This educational apartheid ensured Portuguese colonialism remained a foreign imposition, rather than a system integrating African peoples as equal participants. The colony's strategic importance grew during World War II, when Guinea-Bissau served as a way station for Allied shipping and provided agricultural products for the war effort. Many Africans gained military and political experience while serving in colonial forces, experience that would prove crucial in later independence struggles. The war exposed contradictions of fighting for freedom in Europe while denying it in Africa, contradictions that African intellectuals noted with growing determination to address through organized resistance. By the 1950s, Portuguese colonial rule had achieved administrative control but failed to create political legitimacy, economic development, or cultural integration. The Portuguese had conquered African societies but never learned to govern them in ways that served African interests. This failure would prove fatal when organized nationalism emerged, demonstrating the ultimate weakness of any political system based on force rather than consent. The legacy of Portuguese colonialism in Guinea-Bissau was profound and lasting, creating political, economic, and social patterns that would influence the country long after independence. The extractive economy, weak infrastructure, and political instability that characterized colonial rule would persist into the post-colonial period. Understanding this colonial inheritance is crucial for comprehending both the remarkable achievement of Guinea-Bissau's independence struggle and the enormous difficulties the country has faced in building a stable, prosperous nation from the complex foundations left by Portuguese rule. Chapter 4: The Independence Struggle. In September 1956, 6 young men gathered in a modest house in Bissau to plan what would become one of Africa's most remarkable independence movements. Among them was Amílcar Cabral, a 32-year-old Cape Verdean agronomist who had recently returned from studying in Lisbon, where he had discovered that Portuguese universities were excellent places to learn about both agricultural science and revolution. Also present were his brother, Luis, Aristides Pereira, Fernando Fortes, Julio Almeida, and Elise Turpin, names that would become legendary in the struggle for freedom, though at the time they probably seemed like an overly optimistic book club discussing very dangerous literature. These founding members established the African Party for the Independence of Guinea and Cape Verde, known by its Portuguese acronym PAIGC, with Rafael Barbosa as its first president and Cabral as Secretary General. The party's vision was audacious: to liberate both Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde simultaneously, creating a unified state that would transcend the colonial boundaries imposed by Portuguese administrators who had apparently never consulted the people they were governing about their preferences for national organisation. From the outset, the PAIGC demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of both the political challenges they faced and the international context in which their struggle would unfold. Cabral brought unique qualifications to the independence movement. During his studies in Lisbon, he had helped found the Centro de Estudos Africanos, an association of Portuguese-speaking African students, including future Angolan President Agostinho Neto. These relationships would prove crucial as the PAIGC developed international solidarity and theoretical sophistication. Early PAIGC years were characterized by attempts at peaceful political action that demonstrated Portugal's complete unwillingness to consider African perspectives on governance. The party organized workers' strikes and submitted petitions for political rights, but Portuguese colonial authorities viewed African political demands with the same enthusiasm that vampires show for sunshine. Everything changed on August 3, 1959, during what became known as the Bijagós massacre. Dockworkers in Bissau, supported by the PAIGC, organised a strike demanding better wages and working conditions, requests so reasonable that they should have been uncontroversial. The Portuguese response was to open fire on unarmed demonstrators, killing at least 50 people and wounding several hundred more. This massacre demonstrated Portuguese colonial logic at its most brutal. When faced with reasonable requests for basic human dignity, the appropriate response was apparently mass murder. The Bijagós massacre marked the end of PAIGC faith in peaceful protest and the beginning of their transformation into an armed liberation movement. Cabral and his colleagues concluded that Portuguese colonialism would never be reformed from within, and that independence would have to be won through organised resistance that Portugal could neither ignore nor dismiss. This realisation led to a fundamental shift in PAIGC strategy, from political agitation to military preparation, though always within a framework that emphasised political education and popular mobilisation over purely military solutions. In 1962, the PAIGC began armed operations with an abortive attack on Portuguese positions, but the real beginning of the Guinea-Bissau War of Independence came on January 23, 1963, when PAIGC guerrillas simultaneously attacked Portuguese garrisons at Tite and Catió. These targets were deliberately chosen for their symbolic and strategic value. They were Portuguese bases established in the heart of areas where the PAIGC enjoyed strong popular support, representing Portuguese attempts to maintain control through military occupation rather than political legitimacy. The conflict that followed would last 11 years and earn the designation Portugal's Vietnam for its resemblance to the American experience in Southeast Asia. Like Vietnam, the Guinea-Bissau War featured a colonial power with superior technology and firepower, fighting a guerrilla movement with superior knowledge of local conditions, stronger popular support, and better understanding of the political dimensions of military conflict. The comparison was apt in more ways than Portuguese military planners probably appreciated. The PAIGC's military strategy emphasized political organization over purely military action. Under Cabral's leadership, the party developed liberated zones, areas where Portuguese control had been eliminated and PAIGC authority established. These zones provided safe havens for guerrilla operations, demonstrated the party's capacity for governance, and offered tangible evidence that the independence movement was succeeding. By 1964, the PAIGC was strong enough to hold its first Congress inside Guinea-Bissau territory. The Cacicar Congress transformed the party into the de facto government of a substantial portion of Guinea-Bissau and reorganized the military wing into the Revolutionary Armed Forces of the People, or FARP. The basic fighting unit was the Bigrupo, consisting of 2 commandos of 15 men each that could operate independently or in coordination with other units. PAIGC military tactics emphasized mobility, surprise, and careful avoidance of direct confrontation with superior Portuguese forces. The party's fighters operated from Guinea's dense forests, using intimate knowledge of local terrain to mount hit-and-run attacks against Portuguese convoys and isolated garrisons. They avoided urban areas where Portuguese advantages in firepower could be brought to bear, instead focusing on controlling the countryside where most of the population lived. The PAIGC's approach to guerrilla warfare was notable for its restraint and discipline, reflecting Cabral's understanding that independence movements succeed based on their relationship with civilian populations. FARP fighters were forbidden from abusing local communities or taking food without payment. This discipline paid dividends in popular support that sustained the movement through years of struggle. Portuguese military responses followed conventional counterinsurgency doctrine, with predictably counterproductive results. Unable to distinguish between guerrilla fighters and civilian supporters, Portuguese forces often responded with indiscriminate bombing campaigns that killed more innocent people than PAIGC fighters, driving more people into the liberation movement. International support came primarily from socialist countries and Pan-African organizations. The Soviet Union provided weapons and military advisors, Cuba sent trainers and medical personnel, and China contributed material support and tactical expertise. Training camps in neighboring Guinea-Conakry provided PAIGC fighters with military instruction combined with political education designed to create revolutionary consciousness. The PAIGC's success in establishing liberated zones allowed the party to implement its vision of post-independent society before formal independence. In areas under party control, the PAIGC established schools, medical clinics, and agricultural cooperatives that provided civilians with concrete evidence of what independence might offer. Education operated under the motto, "All those who know should teach those who don't know," while medical care was provided through roving hospitals supplied with equipment from Sweden and the Soviet Union. The party also established mobile markets that provided rural communities with manufactured goods at lower prices than colonial stores, demonstrating that African-controlled institutions could serve African needs better than colonial systems. Portuguese military efforts to counter PAIGC success included both conventional military operations and more creative approaches that reflected growing Portuguese desperation as the war dragged on. General Antonio de Spinola, who commanded Portuguese forces in Guinea from 1968 to 1973, attempted to combine military pressure with political initiatives designed to undermine PAIGC support. His strategy included programs to improve African living conditions, efforts to win the support of traditional leaders, and attempts to create alternative African political organizations that might compete with the PAIGC. Spinola's Better Guinea program represented Portuguese recognition that military force alone could not defeat the liberation movement, and that some accommodation with African nationalism might be necessary. However, these initiatives were undermined by Portuguese unwillingness to offer meaningful political concessions that might have attracted African support. The fundamental contradiction of trying to maintain colonial control while offering development programs designed to demonstrate the benefits of colonial rule proved impossible to resolve in ways that satisfied either Portuguese or African expectations. The most serious blow to the PAIGC came on January 20th, 1973, when Amílcar Cabral was assassinated in Conakry by PAIGC dissidents who were believed to be working with Portuguese agents. Cabral's murder represented not just the loss of the liberation movement's most important leader, but also a betrayal from within that threatened to destroy the unity that had sustained the independence struggle through years of hardship and sacrifice. However, Rather than collapse following Cabral's assassination, the PAIGC demonstrated the institutional strength that he had worked to build throughout the liberation struggle. The party purged those involved in the assassination plot, executing about 100 people suspected of complicity, and reorganized under the joint leadership of Aristides Pereira and Luis Cabral, Amílcar's half-brother. Far from weakening the liberation movement, Cabral's martyrdom seemed to strengthen PAIGC resolve and international support for the independence struggle. In September 1973, less than a year after Cabral's assassination, the PAIGC made one of the most audacious moves in the history of African decolonization by unilaterally declaring Guinea-Bissau's independence. The declaration was made in Medina do Boé, a small town in the southeast of the country near the border with Guinea, demonstrating that the PAIGC controlled enough territory to hold a national assembly and proclaim independence from within the country they were liberating. This unilateral declaration of independence was unprecedented in African decolonization and represented a direct challenge to both Portuguese colonial authority and international diplomatic norms that required colonial powers to grant independence before it could be recognized by other countries. The PAIGC's boldness paid off when the United Nations recognized Guinea-Bissau's independence by a vote of 93-7 in November 1973, with Portugal being one of the 7 countries voting against recognition. UN recognition of Guinea-Bissau's independence before Portuguese recognition represented a diplomatic revolution that undermined the entire structure of colonial international law. By recognizing the PAIGC government, the international community was acknowledging that colonial powers could not indefinitely postpone decolonization, and that liberation movements with sufficient popular support and territorial control could create legitimate governments, even without colonial permission. This precedent had implications far beyond Guinea-Bissau for liberation movements throughout Africa and the developing world. The final phase of the independence struggle coincided with growing political crisis in Portugal itself, where the costs and unpopularity of the colonial wars in Africa had created conditions for revolutionary change. Portuguese casualties in Guinea-Bissau alone numbered 8,000 by 1972, while the economic costs of maintaining forces in Africa drained resources that Portugal needed for domestic development. More importantly, the colonial wars had created profound disillusionment within the Portuguese military, where younger officers increasingly questioned both the purpose and the conduct of what they saw as unwinnable conflicts. On April 25, 1974, a group of Portuguese military officers overthrew the Estado Novo dictatorship in what became known as the Carnation Revolution. The new Portuguese government, led by officers who had served in Africa and witnessed the futility of the colonial wars firsthand, quickly moved to end the conflicts in all of Portugal's African territories. Within months of the coup, Portugal was negotiating directly with liberation movements it had previously refused to recognize. On August 26, 1974, Portugal and the PAIGC signed an agreement in Algiers, formally ending the war and recognizing Guinea-Bissau's independence. Portugal agreed to withdraw all its forces by October and to transfer sovereignty to the PAIGC government, making Guinea-Bissau the first Portuguese African colony to achieve independence through armed struggle. The achievement was remarkable considering the enormous disparity in resources between Portugal and the liberation movement, and it demonstrated that well-organized popular movements could defeat even well-equipped colonial powers when they succeeded in winning the battle for legitimacy and popular support. The success of Guinea-Bissau's independence struggle had implications that extended far beyond the borders of this small West African country. For other African liberation movements, particularly in Angola and Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau provided a model of how to combine military action with political organization, international diplomacy, and social development in ways that created sustainable liberation movements capable of both winning independence and governing effectively afterward. The PAIGC's emphasis on education, healthcare, and economic development in the liberated zones offered a template for creating alternative institutions that could replace colonial structures rather than simply inheriting them. This approach to liberation struggle influenced movements throughout Africa and demonstrated that independence could be achieved through building popular alternatives to colonial rule rather than just destroying colonial institutions, without having anything to replace them. For the international community, Guinea-Bissau's successful independence struggle represented a challenge to the entire system of colonial international law and demonstrated that liberation movements with sufficient popular support could create legitimate governments that deserved international recognition even without colonial approval. This precedent contributed to changing international attitudes toward remaining colonial situations throughout Africa and accelerated the process of decolonization across the continent. On September 10, 1974, Guinea-Bissau officially became an independent nation with Luis Cabral as its first president and the PAIGC as the ruling party. The achievement represented the culmination of 18 years of struggle that had transformed a small group of African intellectuals meeting in Bissau into the government of an independent African state. However, independence also marked the beginning of new challenges as the PAIGC attempted to build a unified, prosperous nation from the complex foundations left by centuries of colonial rule and years of liberation struggle. Chapter 5. Post-Independence Challenges. On September 10, 1974, Guinea-Bissau officially became an independent nation, but independence turned out to be rather like winning the lottery and then discovering that the prize was an enormous fixer-upper house with no electricity, crumbling foundations, and a mortgage larger than the gross domestic product of several small countries. Luis Cabral, Amílcar's half-brother, became the first president, inheriting a country where most of the Portuguese colonial administrators had departed with impressive efficiency, taking with them not only their expertise but apparently all the office supplies, spare parts, and institutional memory of how anything actually worked. The immediate challenges facing the new nation were staggering. The independence war had devastated Guinea-Bissau's already limited infrastructure, destroying bridges, roads, and communication networks that had never been particularly impressive to begin with. Portuguese investment in the colony had focused primarily on extracting wealth rather than building sustainable institutions, leaving behind an economy that was essentially a collection of export crops and trading posts, rather than anything resembling a modern state. Life expectancy was 35 years, over 90% of the population was illiterate, and rice production had fallen by 70% during the war years, creating a country that could not even feed itself. President Luis Cabral and the PAIGC government embarked on an ambitious socialist transformation program that aimed to create a modern, egalitarian society based on the principles that had guided the liberation struggle, drawing on support from the Soviet Union, Cuba, China, and Nordic countries. The government launched comprehensive programs to expand education and healthcare, build infrastructure, and develop a planned economy that would serve the needs of the people rather than foreign capitalists. The literacy program, implemented with assistance from Brazilian educator Paulo Freire, attempted to combine basic education with political consciousness raising, while new medical facilities brought healthcare to rural areas that had never seen a doctor. However, the socialist experiment faced enormous obstacles that went beyond the normal challenges of post-colonial development. The PAIGC's vision of uniting Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde into a single state created tensions between the mainland African population and Cape Verdean intellectuals and administrators who were perceived as maintaining colonial patterns of dominance even after independence. These tensions were exacerbated by economic policies that prioritized state control over market mechanisms, creating inefficiencies and shortages that made daily life increasingly difficult for ordinary people who had hoped independence would bring immediate improvements to their living conditions. The planned economy that worked well in the liberated zones during the war proved less effective when applied to an entire country trying to participate in global markets. State control of agriculture led to declining production, while government monopolies on trade created black market activities that undermined official economic policies. The government's emphasis on ideological purity sometimes conflicted with practical needs, as when qualified Portuguese technicians were dismissed for political reasons, even when their expertise was desperately needed for development projects. By the late 1970s, food shortages had become chronic, and basic consumer goods were increasingly unavailable through official channels. Political tensions within the PAIGC reflected deeper divisions in Guinea-Bissau society that the independence struggle had temporarily united but not permanently resolved. Ethnic differences between the Balanta majority, who had provided much of the military strength of the liberation movement, and the Cape Verdean and mulatto elite who dominated the government, created resentments that were often expressed in terms of complaints about discrimination and favoritism. Military officers, many of whom were Balanta, felt increasingly marginalized by a government that seemed more interested in ideological education than in addressing the practical concerns of people who had fought for independence but were not seeing the benefits they had been promised. These tensions came to a head following a failed coup attempt in 1978 that resulted in the execution of several senior military officers and created an atmosphere of suspicion and paranoia within the government. The discovery of mass graves containing executed Portuguese soldiers and alleged collaborators further undermined confidence in the government's commitment to reconciliation and human rights. By 1980, even supporters of the PAIGC were beginning to question whether the party that had successfully led the independence struggle was capable of governing a modern state. The situation became critical when severe drought in 1979 and 1980 created famine conditions that the government was unable to address effectively. Rice imports from friendly socialist countries proved insufficient to meet basic needs, while government restrictions on private trade prevented local merchants from organizing alternative food distribution systems. The crisis, which became known as the rice coup because of its connection to food shortages, demonstrated the government's inability to provide the most basic function of any state, feeding its people. On November 14, 1980, Prime Minister João Bernardo Vieira, known by his wartime nickname Nino, led a bloodless military coup that overthrew President Luís Cabral and fundamentally altered Guinea-Bissau's political trajectory. Vieira, a papal from a minority ethnic group who had distinguished himself as a military commander during the Independence War, represented a new generation of African leaders who were more concerned with practical governance than with ideological purity. The coup was initially welcomed by many citizens who hoped it would bring more effective leadership and an end to the economic crisis that had made daily life increasingly difficult. The 1980 coup marked the definitive end of the dream of Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde unity, as the PAIGC branch in Cape Verde immediately distanced itself from the new military government and eventually formed a separate party. This split represented not just a political disagreement, but a fundamental recognition that the two territories, despite their shared colonial history and liberation struggle, had developed different interests and identities that could not be easily reconciled within a single state. Vieira's government faced the same fundamental challenges that had defeated Luís Cabral, but with the additional burden of legitimizing military rule in a country that had fought for democratic ideals. The new Revolutionary Council suspended the constitution and consolidated power in the hands of military officers, many of whom lacked experience in civilian administration. While Vieira promised to address economic problems through more pragmatic policies, the underlying structural issues that had created the crisis remained largely unchanged, and the government's authoritarian tendencies created new problems even as they attempted to solve old ones. In 1982, under pressure from international financial institutions, Vieira's government implemented a structural adjustment program that marked Guinea-Bissau's transition from socialist planning to market-oriented policies. The program, funded by the International Monetary Fund and World Bank, included currency devaluation, reduction of government subsidies, privatization of state enterprises, and elimination of trade restrictions. These policies were designed to increase economic efficiency and attract foreign investment, but they also eliminated many of the social services that had been among the few tangible benefits of independence for ordinary citizens. The structural adjustment program reflected a broader global shift away from the socialist development models that had been popular during the immediate post-independence period toward market-based approaches that emphasized economic growth over social equity. For Guinea-Bissau, this transition was particularly difficult because the country lacked the institutional capacity and human resources needed to implement complex economic reforms effectively. The result was often the worst of both worlds. Neither the social benefits of socialism nor the economic efficiency of capitalism, but rather a system that combined bureaucratic inefficiency with market inequality. Throughout the 1980s, Vieira's rule was characterized by political instability, economic stagnation, and recurring coup attempts that demonstrated both the regime's unpopularity and its determination to maintain power through force. Alleged coup plots in 1983, 1985, and 1993 resulted in numerous arrests, trials, and executions that created a climate of fear and suspicion within the military and government. The most serious conspiracy, in 1986, led to the execution of 6 people, including First Vice President Paulo Correa, demonstrating that even the highest levels of government were not immune to Vieira's paranoia about potential threats to his authority. International pressure for democratization, combined with domestic opposition to authoritarian rule, gradually forced Vieira to consider political reforms that would legitimize his government through elections rather than military force. In 1991, a new constitution was adopted that included human rights guarantees, abolished the death penalty, and allowed for multiple political parties. These changes represented significant progress toward democratic governance, though skeptics noted that constitutional provisions meant little if the government remained unwilling to respect them in practice. Guinea-Bissau's first multi-party elections in 1994 marked a historic transition toward democratic governance, though one that would prove fragile and incomplete. Vieira, running as the PAIGC candidate, narrowly defeated Kumba Iala of the Social Renewal Party in a runoff election that international observers considered generally free and fair. The elections demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of democratic reform in a country with weak institutions, limited resources, and deep social divisions that had been exacerbated by years of authoritarian rule. However, democratic governance proved as challenging as military rule in addressing Guinea-Bissau's fundamental problems of poverty, underdevelopment, and weak state capacity. The new democratic government inherited all the structural problems that had plagued previous administrations, including an economy dependent on volatile agricultural exports, limited human resources, weak infrastructure, and social divisions that made consensus building extremely difficult. Moreover, the transition to democracy occurred during a period of reduced international support, as the end of the Cold War eliminated the strategic importance that had previously attracted foreign aid from both socialist and capitalist countries. Economic problems were compounded by Guinea-Bissau's decision to join the West African Economic and Monetary Union in 1997 which required the adoption of the CFA franc and coordination of economic policies with larger neighbours like Senegal and Côte d'Ivoire. While membership promised greater regional integration and monetary stability, it also reduced the government's ability to use fiscal and monetary policies to address domestic economic problems. The result was increased vulnerability to external economic shocks and reduced policy autonomy at a time when the country needed maximum flexibility to address its development challenges. The tensions that had been building throughout Vieira's presidency finally exploded in June 1998 when he dismissed military chief Ansoumana Mane, accusing him of arms trafficking to Casamance separatist rebels in Senegal. Mane's rebellion, supported by much of the military and significant portions of the civilian population, triggered a devastating civil war that lasted 11 months and destroyed much of the progress that had been made since independence. The conflict was particularly tragic because it pitted former Liberation War comrades against each other, destroying the unity that had been the PAIGC's greatest strength during the independence struggle. The Civil War revealed the extent to which Guinea-Bissau's political system had become dependent on personal networks and ethnic loyalties rather than institutional mechanisms for resolving conflicts. Vieira's support came primarily from his presidential guard, recruited largely from his own papal ethnic group, while Mane enjoyed backing from Balanta soldiers who felt marginalized by the government's favoritism toward minorities. International intervention by Senegalese and Guinean forces prolonged the conflict by preventing either side from achieving decisive victory, while peace agreements repeatedly broke down because neither side trusted the other to honour commitments made under external pressure. The war's end in May 1999, when Vieira was forced into exile, marked the collapse of the political system governing Guinea-Bissau since independence. The PAIGC's legitimacy was destroyed by leaders fighting each other rather than addressing national problems. Military intervention in politics became normalized, creating instability patterns that would persist for decades. Kumba Iala's election in 2000 marked the first peaceful transfer of power between different parties, but his presidency was plagued by the same problems: economic stagnation, political polarization, and military interference. His removal by military coup in September 2003 demonstrated that fundamental governance problems remained unresolved. By the early 2000s, Guinea-Bissau had gained an unwelcome reputation as a failed state, characterized by political instability, economic collapse, and involvement in international drug trafficking. The post-independence period had demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of political independence as a solution to colonial problems. While independence had ended foreign domination, it had not automatically resolved the deeper structural issues that centuries of colonialism had embedded in society and economy. Chapter 6: Modern Guinea-Bissau. By the dawn of the 21st century, Guinea-Bissau had gained an unfortunate distinction that no country ever wants to earn: the dubious honour of being labelled Africa's first narco-state by the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. This designation reflected a new chapter in the country's complex relationship with global forces, one where geography that had once made Guinea-Bissau a strategic asset for Portuguese slave traders and later for independence fighters, now made it an ideal transit point for Colombian cocaine cartels seeking to reach European markets through what drug enforcement officials grimly called the back door to Europe. The emergence of Guinea-Bissau as a major cocaine trafficking hub began in the mid-2000s, when increased policing in traditional Caribbean routes forced South American drug cartels to seek new pathways for their lucrative trade. Guinea-Bissau offered everything that organized crime could want: weak state institutions, porous borders, hundreds of uninhabited islands perfect for clandestine operations, limited law enforcement capacity, and a desperately poor population willing to participate in any economic activity that promised better living conditions. The country's geographical position on the Atlantic coast, combined with its shared Portuguese colonial history with Brazil, made it a natural choice for traffickers seeking to move an estimated 25 to 30 tons of cocaine annually from South America to European consumers. The drug trade that emerged in Guinea-Bissau was notable not for the violence that characterizes narco-economies in other parts of the world, but for its integration into existing political and military structures that had been shaped by decades of instability and weak governance. Unlike Mexico or Afghanistan, where drug trafficking often operates in opposition to state authority, in Guinea-Bissau the cocaine trade became embedded within government institutions themselves, with politicians, military officers, and civil servants either actively participating in trafficking operations or receiving payments to ignore them. This integration created a situation where the distinction between state and criminal activity became increasingly blurred, making traditional law enforcement approaches largely ineffective. The scale of the cocaine trade relative to Guinea-Bissau's tiny economy cannot be overstated. Conservative estimates suggest that at least 30 tons of cocaine, valued at over $250 million, pass through the country annually, a sum that exceeds Guinea-Bissau's entire national budget and represents more money than most citizens will ever see in their lifetimes. For a country where 70% of the population lives below the poverty line and the average person earns less than $2 per day, the arrival of drug money created economic opportunities that legitimate employment simply could not match, while also introducing corruption that undermined already weak institutions. The political implications of the drug trade became apparent through coups and assassinations, demonstrating how narcotics trafficking intertwined with Guinea-Bissau's chronic instability. The most dramatic example occurred in March 2009, when President João Bernardo Vieira was assassinated by soldiers who believed he was responsible for the army chief's death hours earlier. Many observers linked these killings to drug trafficking disputes, particularly after General Antonio Injai, later indicted by the United States for drug trafficking, emerged as the de facto military leader. International response to Guinea-Bissau's transformation into a narco-state has been extensive but largely ineffective. The United States Drug Enforcement Administration achieved some arrests, notably the 2013 capture of former Navy Chief José Américo Bubo Nachuto, described as a major drug kingpin. However, these successes proved temporary, as new networks quickly replaced disrupted ones, and fundamental conditions making drug trafficking attractive remained unchanged. Despite its reputation as a narco-state, modern Guinea-Bissau defies many stereotypes about countries dominated by drug trafficking. Visitors often comment on the relative peace and safety of daily life, the stunning beauty of the Bijagós Islands, and the warmth and hospitality of ordinary citizens who continue to pursue their traditional livelihoods despite the chaos of their political system. The country's small scale and strong social networks mean that the extreme violence that characterizes drug trafficking in larger countries like Mexico or Colombia has been largely absent, though the corrosive effects of corruption and criminality are nonetheless profound. The resilience of Guinea-Bissau's cultural identity in the face of political instability and criminal infiltration represents one of the most remarkable aspects of contemporary life in the country. Traditional music, particularly the rhythmic genre known as gumbe, continues to thrive as the soundtrack of both celebration and resistance. Gumbe music, which fuses about 10 different folk music traditions from Guinea-Bissau's diverse ethnic communities, is often sung in Creole with lyrics that provide social commentary, satirical observations about political events, and expressions of community solidarity that transcend the divisions that plague formal politics. The Bijagós Archipelago, with its 88 islands scattered across the Atlantic, remains a UNESCO Biosphere Reserve and one of the most important cultural and environmental treasures of West Africa. The Bijagós people who inhabit about 20 of these islands have maintained their distinctive matriarchal society and traditional ecological practices despite centuries of external pressures. Their culture, deeply connected to the sea and characterized by elaborate masks and ceremonies that honor ancestors and natural forces, represents a form of indigenous knowledge and social organization that has proven remarkably resistant to outside influence. Economic life continues to revolve around activities connecting the country to global markets while maintaining traditional practices. Cashew nuts, which Guinea-Bissau ranks among the world's top producers of, represent both possibilities and limitations of global integration. Approximately 90% of export revenues come from cashew production, supporting hundreds of thousands of small-scale farmers. However, lack of processing infrastructure means most cashews are exported raw to India and Vietnam, limiting value retained in Guinea-Bissau. Fishing remains crucial but demonstrates development challenges. The extensive coastline and rich marine ecosystems could support sustainable fishing industries, but illegal fishing by foreign vessels, limited enforcement capacity, and lack of investment mean local communities often struggle to compete with well-equipped international operations. Education challenges illustrate the complex relationship between traditional knowledge systems and modern development needs. While literacy rates remain low, this obscures sophisticated forms of oral culture and traditional ecological knowledge transmitted through families and communities. The country's multiple languages, Portuguese as official, Creole as lingua franca, and 20-plus ethnic languages, reflect both rich cultural diversity and practical challenges of creating unified educational systems. Religious life exemplifies Guinea-Bissau's syncretic approach to cultural change. While approximately 50% practice Islam and 20% Christianity, these religions coexist with traditional beliefs rather than replacing them. Many Muslims and Christians also participate in traditional ceremonies and maintain relationships with ancestral spirits reflecting worldviews developed over centuries. The diaspora communities that have emerged as Guinea-Bissauans seek opportunities abroad represent both a loss and an asset for the country's development. Significant populations now live in Portugal, France, Spain, and other European countries, where they often work in construction, agriculture, and service industries while sending remittances home. These communities maintain strong connections through cultural associations, religious organizations, and informal networks that provide both economic support and cultural continuity across national boundaries. Environmental conservation faces the same challenges confronting all development aspects: excellent policies and international support undermined by limited implementation capacity. The Bijagós Islands UNESCO Biosphere Reserve designation reflects international recognition of their ecological importance, particularly as nesting sites for green sea turtles and habitat for West African manatees, dolphins, and diverse bird species. However, protecting these ecosystems requires resources and enforcement capabilities that Guinea-Bissau often lacks, especially when environmental protection conflicts with immediate economic needs. Women's roles illustrate both persistence of traditional gender patterns and emergence of new participation opportunities. While women in many ethnic groups historically held important roles in agriculture, trade, and household management, formal political participation has been limited. Recent years have seen increasing numbers in government positions, civil society leadership, and business ownership, though significant barriers remain in education, healthcare access, and economic opportunities. Technology and connectivity reflect uneven development patterns, where mobile phones become increasingly common but reliable electricity and internet access remain rare. Mobile communication has transformed social and economic relationships by allowing people in remote areas to maintain contact with family abroad, coordinate market activities, and access information. However, digital divides between urban and rural areas mean technological benefits are unevenly distributed. Recent political history demonstrates both persistent instability and gradual emergence of democratic institutions. President Umaro Sissoco Embalo's 2019 election marked the first time a president completed a full term and was replaced through democratic elections rather than coups. While Embalo's administration faces challenges, including accusations of authoritarianism and continued drug trade involvement, the precedent of peaceful political transition represents meaningful progress towards sustainable governance. International efforts to support development have evolved from emergency humanitarian assistance and conflict resolution toward longer-term approaches emphasizing institution building, economic development, and regional integration. The European Union, United Nations, African Union, and Economic Community of West African States maintain significant programs in Guinea-Bissau, though coordination among initiatives remains challenging. The country's small size and strategic location mean modest investments can have significant impacts, but persistent institutional weakness limits external assistance effectiveness. Civil society organizations and independent media provide reasons for cautious optimism about democratic development, despite pressures from criminal networks and authoritarian tendencies. Local organizations working on women's rights, environmental conservation, and judicial reform have shown remarkable persistence despite limited resources and occasional government harassment. Independent radio stations and newspapers continue providing platforms for political debate, though journalists face increasing pressure when reporting conflicts with powerful interests. Future prospects depend largely on whether Guinea-Bissau can break cycles of political instability, weak governance, and economic dependence, characterizing its post-independence experience. Discovery of offshore oil reserves offers potential for increased government revenues, though other West African countries' experiences suggest natural resource wealth can exacerbate corruption and conflict if not managed transparently. Climate change poses additional challenges, particularly for coastal communities and island populations facing potential displacement from sea level rise and increased storm intensity. Youth face particular challenges where traditional opportunities remain limited while illegal activities promise quick profits but long-term dangers. The large young population, with over 40% of citizens under 15 years of age, represents both the country's greatest potential asset and most pressing challenge. Educational opportunities remain limited, unemployment is high, and many young people see emigration or drug trafficking involvement as their only economic paths, creating brain drain and social problems that undermine long-term development prospects. Regional integration through organizations like the Economic Community of West African States provides opportunities to overcome limitations imposed by small domestic markets and weak institutions. Membership in the West African Monetary Union and Customs Area offers potential benefits from increased trade and investment, though it also requires policy coordination and institutional capacity that Guinea-Bissau sometimes struggles to maintain. Success depends partly on political stability and good governance that remain elusive goals. Despite decades of overwhelming challenges, Guinea-Bissau's people demonstrate remarkable resilience, creativity, and hope. Cultural preservation, alongside adaptation, reflects sophisticated understanding of maintaining identity while pursuing development. The country's small size, often viewed as disadvantage, may provide advantages for implementing new approaches to governance and development that could serve as models for other small states. The story from independence to present illustrates both possibilities and limitations of political sovereignty as a solution to colonial legacies. While independence ended foreign control and created opportunities for self-determination, It couldn't immediately overcome centuries of extractive relationships and weak institutions. Building sustainable, prosperous societies requires not just political independence but economic transformation, social cohesion, and effective governance, achievable only through generations of sustained effort. Perhaps most remarkable is not the persistence of problems, sadly common among post-colonial African states, but the endurance of people's determination to create a better future despite enormous obstacles. In markets across Bissau, villages throughout the countryside, and the beautiful Bijagós Islands, ordinary citizens continue to work, create, and build communities embodying solidarity, resilience, and hope that no amount of political turmoil can destroy. Their story reminds us that a nation's true measure lies not in leaders' actions but in people's daily courage and creativity who continue writing Guinea-Bissau's history one small act of persistence at a time.